Alan Jones, right across Australia.
Yes, it's 10 and a half minutes to 8, 10 and a half to 7 in Queensland. It is November 11, Remembrance Day. The anniversary of the day in 1918 when the guns on the Western Front fell silent after 4 years of continuous warfare. For us, as with many nations, the sacrifice was the greatest in any theatre of war. I wonder if we were any better then than we are now in recognising not only the contribution our troops made, but looking after them when they came home. I recently received a letter from Adam Holloway, who sent me a copy of his book, Duty, Nobly Done. It's Adam's first book, released late last year. It's the story of 11 young men from his family who volunteered to fight in the First World War. Their service took them from Gallipoli to the Western Front. Of the 11, 3 were killed, most of the rest were injured. Of the 3 who died, there's no known grave. I thought on this Remembrance Day we'd have a look at the sorts of contribution these people made and the prices they paid. He's a very interesting character, Adam Holloway. He's on the line, a young man. Adam, good morning.
Good morning, Alan. Thank you so much for having me on.
Not at all. You're an interesting character. You've got a background in law enforcement, more than 16 years with the Queensland Police, and then this fascination with World War One. Tell us about that history side of things.
Yeah, so Alan, I have been interested in military history since I was about 13, so over 30 years of military history. My father is a Vietnam veteran, and in recent times we had been doing the family tree, and we discovered the 11 young men that went off to fight. And initially we thought it was just my great-grandfather who'd gone, and in 99 I went to France and followed where I thought he'd been. And then we found out about the list of 11, and when I went back in 2012 I was able to walk in their footsteps and learn more about them.
Dear. Took you 6 years, I understand. So you found that they were all directly descendant from the British migrants George and Sarah Holloway, and 7 of the men were Holloways.
That's correct, yes, absolutely.
So Edwin and Alfred were brothers, and then William, Henry and Ernest were brothers, and then there was Frank Holloway and Eric Holloway, and the remaining 4 were sets of brothers, Hilton and Ernest Brooks, and Arthur and Ernest Miss Campbell.
That's correct, yes.
So they were all raised to believe, I guess you say in the book, that not only were king and empire worth fighting for, but they were worth dying for.
Yeah, so these boys were first and second generation Australians, so their parents and their grandparents were British migrants and had come out to start a new life. And they'd been brought up with stories of how great the British Empire was, and in fact, Frank Holloway actually joins up the day after the war is declared. So he's the first one to go. So it's a fascinating time. 100 years ago, we can't comprehend, I think, that mentality.
No, you can't, given we're a population of only 5 million, and all these people volunteering. You describe these in the book as volunteers to a man who weren't spurred by the desire to kill, but rather by a sense of duty, and also, of course, because their mates were enlisting.
That's right. I as I learned more about them and their mates, I discovered that it was like not so much pressure to go in terms. It was more inferred pressure that if your teammates on the local cricket team or your mates at school, and then you thought, well, I've got to go too.
Quite. Did they volunteer individually, or did they know the others were all signing up as well? Because your first chapter is called The Great Adventure. They just saw this as a great adventure.
That's right. With Frank, he was the first to join, and then I think essentially a couple of them were knocked back initially because of medical issues and also being attached to the local militia training units. And so it wasn't until after Gallipoli that interest in the war began to increase again. And then the boys just started to enlist in a procession, and the ones who had previously been knocked back were finding they could get in now. So they needed men so badly.
And when they got there, how widely dispersed did they end up being in terms of their various units within the Australian Army? I mean, once they arrived in Europe, how far apart did they end up?
Most of them ended up in different battalions and brigades and divisions, but ultimately one thing I found was the number of times they crisscrossed and actually met up was quite amazing discoveries, that they'd be 12,000 miles from home, and when they were behind the lines, they would meet up in a village in the middle of nowhere.
Did the 11 have any idea what was happening with the others?
Generally not in those days. You generally didn't find out for weeks, months, and maybe even not at all, unless you received a letter from one of the others. So they all had an idea which battalions they were in, but they didn't know where each one was at any given moment.
But you write how they were able to determine you were able to determine the movements of them at various times to within a 50-metre range. How did you do that?
Well, thank you for the amazing blessing that the War Memorial is in their scanning in war diaries and maps, and also the service records of the boys. You're able to follow map references and actually go to within grid references on a trench map where they've got the red squiggly lines which denote a trench, and then you follow the battalion's movements, and that gives you an idea exactly where they were. So it made it a lot easier.
A lot easier. Cut it out. You've done phenomenal work. Then of the 3 who died, do we know what happened to them?
Well, thankfully, they had witnesses to their death. Their mates ultimately buried them on the battlefield, and letters home explained how they died, and also some Red Cross records also explained it too. So that was able to give me an idea of where they fell, so I could walk the ground, not just go to the memorial where they're named.
No, but there is no grave for them.
No.
And then 8 who came home. Henry Bonsall Chick Holloway died in September 1942 at the age of 48. William George Bill Holloway died in August 1954 at the age of 62. Ernest James Nugg Holloway died in May 1960 at the age of 64. Arthur Leaning Miss Campbell died in March 1961 at the age of 67. Ernest Bonsall, or Ern, Miss Campbell died in October 64 at the age of 71. Eric Mansfield Holloway died in 1966 at the age of 67. Ernest George Brooks died in April 1973 at the age of 76. And Frank Bonsall Holloway, the first of the 11 to enlist, as Adam has told us, died in March 1974 at the age of 80. I was very close, I have to say, in Queensland, Adam, with a Miss Campbell family. It's not a common name, is it?
No, it's not actually, and one of the most common mispronunciations of the name is Miss Campbell, and that was quite confusing during the war on a couple of occasions. So,
that's right. I thought it was Miss and then Campbell, whereas it's Miscamble. Do we know how much contact the survivors had with one another after they returned home?
Essentially, the boys, I think, once they'd come home, trying to come to terms with what they'd gone through, were very... they moved around a lot, essentially. I think once they'd had that taste of travel, and then they couldn't settle in their hometowns because of the loss and the constant reminder. So they kept in contact. I know that most of them were prolific letter writers, and most of them ended up in Brisbane.
Wonderful.
So, they did keep in contact.
Wonderful. You've done a hell of a job. It's a terrific story. So well done, Adam, and the name lives on through you. So it's glad that we could talk, and we let people know that they should read about it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Al. I really appreciate it.
Not at all. Adam Holloway. The book is called Duty, Nobly Done. And to buy a signed copy, you can go to adamholloway.com.au. The book is published by Big Sky. Go to bigskypublishing.com.au.